metaphysics. And so the reason Bonaventure's philosophy is, or metaphysics rather, is exemplaristic, or the focus is upon formal exemplary causality, is because natural philosophy and moral philosophy pertain more to efficient and final causality, whereas formal causality pertains directly to metaphysics. And metaphysics considered as not only a knowledge of essences or species that are universal, an intuition of what something is, saying about something what it is formally. It also has to do with, and this is very important for Bonaventure, it has to do with his entire metaphysics as exemplaristic, or in the words of Christopher Cullen, semiotic. And so what Bonaventure's arguing here is that exemplary causality has to do with signs. So things are in themselves, but things are in themselves both what they are, and in addition to what they are, they point to their source or cause. So this is very important when we will come to consider how illumination works vis-a-vis the divine ideas and exemplarism. So we'll get to that. But the key point is why Bonaventure focuses so much on exemplarism is his understanding of all created things, not only as things in themselves, but as things that point to their source, or things that point to other things. For example, lower creatures like a stone or a tree or a lion can point to human persons as symbols. Now that's an appropriated symbol, but still it's a useful symbol, and it helps unmask or articulate what Bonaventure is getting at when he speaks of his semiotic metaphysics. And so this is something to keep in mind as we move forward. So getting back to Alex, go ahead. I mean, Dr. Plato.
Ask a few questions, or do you want to wait till the end? Whatever you want.
Why don't we get through questions 2 and 3, and then before we move to question 4, we can kind of reset and ask some questions, because questions 1, 2, and 3 of the Descientia still have to do with divine knowledge, and I think we can make this fairly brief. So in the first place, now moving to a discussion of question 2, Bonaventure is asking. Let me see exactly what he's asking. Remind myself. So in the first question, he asked the question whether or not God knows and comprehends an infinite number of things with a knowledge of simple intelligence. And he affirms that this is the case. This has to do with God's perfection in being, and then his perfection as expressing all possible truths. So he has to have an infinite number of ideas because there are an infinite number of possible entities or states of affairs that God can create. So he knows himself as intensively infinite, and he knows all other things through the extensional infinity of his knowledge. And then question 2 addresses whether God knows things by means of their likenesses or by means of their proper essence. Now this is an important question, and it raises difficulties because Bonaventure says no, God knows things by means of their likenesses, not by means of a created thing's proper essence. And if we remember this discussion, Bonaventure distinguishes the way or the modes in which ideas obtain or are veridical are in the things themselves. Like, for example, the divine idea is manifested in a dog, essentially and formally, because a dog is essentially and formally a dog. So the idea manifests itself as a form in a dog, an essential form. But obviously, it's not the divine idea itself. Secondly, the divine ideas also exist in a certain way as accidents of the mind, namely in abstractions, universals that the mind has of things. Universal of the mind that the mind has of a dog, for example. And then finally, a third mode is that these ideas exist in the eternal art, or in the eternal exemplar. As the divine truth expressing all knowable things, or the expressive truth of all knowable things. And so those are 3 modes, and Bonaventure is just trying to avoid here that he knows created things through their essences. When he denies that, he's saying that he doesn't arrive at knowledge of, say, a dog or a tree by actually looking at a given dog or a given tree. So he doesn't abstract universal ideas from given things. Rather, he knows these things through what he calls their likeness. And for Bonaventure, likeness here is simply the expressive truth of a thing through which, or by means of which, God knows something else. So in Bonaventure's epistemology, it seems as though these divine ideas are the means of knowing things that aren't God. But since they're the means of knowing things that aren't identical with God, in some sense, namely in themselves or in the created mind, he knows these things through these ideas that he expresses, or these eternal expressive ideas, in his own reality as truth, rather than he looks at a dog or a tree or a cat and then says, I have, through this act of apprehension and abstraction, a universal concept of a dog, cat, or a tree. Does that make sense? So what he's intentionally avoiding here is that God's knowledge admits of being informed by anything that is not God. He's wanting to say, by virtue of the divine being itself, as truth, God contains in himself the reasons or the ideas for all other things, even those things that exist outside of himself. And so that's why he says he knows things through their likenesses rather than through their proper essence. Perhaps now would be a good time. Is that clear what's going on and what's at stake here?
I guess the question I would have is that likeness sort of, I mean, you could, I don't know, like some sort of, forgive the analogy, but like a database of both the thing and the particular thing and all the things that happen to that thing, all of its, so I mean, basically like God's likeness of a human person being, their background, their own personality, their, deepermost, innermost thoughts, all the choices they make throughout their life. I mean, it seems that it would have to sort of be that if that's the means. And it's not saying that by knowing that it's constricting in any way, because he would also know as a simple possible, what would happen in any opposite case where they chose B instead of A at any point in their life.
I think that's essentially what he's saying, is by virtue of God's infinite knowledge, on the basis of the expressive truth of the divine being, which expresses all of these possible and real and future, possible, present, and future, and final realities. Somehow those divine ideas sufficiently express not only every possibility, but every actuality. And a distinction that needs to be made is something he does make, I believe, in question 2 of the De Scientia, between divine ideas as mere possibles, the knowledge of simple intelligence, and then the divine ideas as through or in a mirror, or through or in the exemplar. And when you speak of through or in the exemplar, you're already implying Bonaventure's notion of art. And so with this notion of art having a practical effect or end outside of the knowledge itself, it's practical knowledge, know-how knowledge that causes something or is in order to cause something, Bonaventure would know through his divine ideas in relation or in and through his will act to create this state of affairs or to will this future or final state of affairs. He knows these ideas with a kind of voluntary note. Because God wills these things to take place, they're no longer just simple intelligence of possibilities. And so there always is, with respect to add extra knowledge of God, even in and through the likenesses, there's always concomitant with that a will act to create or to realize this future state of affairs. So in some sense, I do think you have to say, with Bonaventure, even though he says God knows all things, in and through what he says, the exemplar, the one exemplar, or the one divine idea, or the one word of knowledge, within this word of knowledge, there's a containment of all these other possibilities that are irreducible to themselves, meaning the idea of a cat is not the idea of a dog, but because they are internal to God, they're radically identical with his essence. Thus, they're radically identical with God on a kind of vertical level, moving up into the essence. Horizontally, between themselves, there is some sort of minimal distinction that Bonaventure draws, just even between those possibles. But then it seems like there's another moment or note beyond just the knowledge of possibles to the knowledge of ideas, or through ideas, of what he wills to create too. So there's a distinction between necessary knowledge, simple intelligence, and contingent knowledge that is based upon God's free will to elect this or that present reality, and these are those future and final states of affairs. And so there's a subdistinction, and you can see with his quotation on page 89 of Dionysius, I think that distinction is built right into his account of the divine ideas. So he doesn't limit the divine ideas to just, intellectual realities that just happen to the intellect. Because remember, for Bonaventure and for Scotus, the intellect, as opposed to the will, is a natural power. That means it operates according to a nature, and the nature is specified or realized according to its end. So the nature is always, in a sense, in this analogy, or in this kind of mode of analysis, it's in a sense passive with respect to its object. It's always ready to be informed and fulfilled or completed by its object. Whereas the will, on the other hand, is always a spontaneous power that is intrinsically free and self-activating. And so with respect to God's knowledge of contingent created realities, it's always by virtue of him willing these created realities that he has these ideas of contingent realities. So there's always a notion of God's freedom. He doesn't reduce the finite order to a kind of necessary emanationism, like in terms of a Neoplatonic or a Platonic schema, you see. So he's trying to avoid that. Then, just to kind of rehearse what's going on here, I drew a kind of mental roadmap of what's going on. I'll hold this up, and I have a couple more images that will come out through this seminar. I will hold this up so you can kind of follow along what's going on. And if you all can somehow capture this quickly, or capture it, one of you, and then email it to the other members of the conversation, that'd be great. So I'll hold it up. Can you see this adequately? Is that good?
Yes, I can see it, but you have to keep holding it still there. There's a lot of information on it.
Right, I'm hoping you can get an image of it, and then I will look over it with you all together.
Got it, right. Okay.
Where's the screenshot?
I don't know.
A little closer. Up a little. Right there. Down a little. Down. There, right there. Augustine got it.
Okay, great. I'll give you a couple seconds.
So are you going to send that as email?
I think so. Are you guys, is that able to be sent to by email to the participants of the seminar?
Sure. Have I got emails?
Alex Plato, just like it sounds, at gmail.com.
Yep.
And then I'm sure you have Griswold's email.
I got Griswold's.
Could you send it to Raw Charles or
Give him a second. He's clicking on the pictures and he's gonna open up the email. You gotta wait a
Fine. That's totally fine. I'll just go on and continue the discussion. Question 2. We can return to this chart when we get a chance. Go ahead, Dr. Plato.
So were you? Can we ask questions about question 2 or?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to know if you could say more about the idea of this notion of expression or the expressive truth of a thing. maybe even Latin term there and the lexical term, if you know.
I have to, let me get my text. I think that Latin is expressivum. Let me see here.
Did you get it?
Okay.
It's clearer.
So Bonaventure, when he's talking about likenesses here, he distinguishes between two different basic forms of likeness. Let me find my notes here. I don't want to get this.
It's on page 90 if people have the text, I think.
Right. On page 90, then there's a footnote where he says he's hitting this Boethius.
Right, I can't speak exactly to Boethius, but we will get into the distinction he's making on about these terms, especially with respect to analogy and univocity, and his understanding of analogy by proportion and proportionality, which actually goes beyond what's presented in this text, and then analogy of simple resemblance. Because the analogy of simple resemblance is, I think, where it opens the door to a need for a univocal account of concepts, even though the terms of the analogy, namely the divine idea and the created idea, are only analogous in se. There's got to be some sort of ratio or order within both sides of this term that explains their connection and how you can just simply have a simple resemblance, a one-to-one resemblance. Bonaventure doesn't ever really explain this, but there's a distinction he makes between expressing and expressive.
Okay.
And the notion of expressing, that's primarily what Bonaventure accounts to the divine truth as it terminates in these various ideas or knowledge of the divine art or ratio or exemplar. And I think what he's getting at with the term expressing is he's trying to indicate that this activity of the divine being as truth is always forever expressing these notions. It never reaches a term or a completion of this expression, so it's always dynamic, and it's never in a sense closed off. So it's expressing these truths insofar as the divine being is infinite and eternally active. But insofar, on the other hand, as the expressions themselves of the expressing truths connote or realize distinct ideas or ratios, then you can say, well, their term is something other than, notionally at least, than the divine truth itself considered generally. Like an aspect or something contained or something the divine truth expresses or is expressing is always this infinite set of truths or ideas that God knows because he has an extensive knowledge of all possibles and actuals. And so expressive here has to do with Bonaventure's understanding of the dynamic, fecund reality of the divine truth to express all truths. So it's never a point of arrival. In a sense, the point of arrival is the end point. All he's saying is basically the divine being is infinite. It's fully actual, but it's always fully actualizing in its fullness of actuality.
So when he says expressive, like on the conclusion on page 9, says that they conclusion, the large by the means of each perfectly representative expressive.
I think they just had trouble with
And so
You think it's his claim?
they can be expressed. Or,
I think that it would be predicated. The possibility was somebody making a cappuccino in the background. I heard a. No. What I think what it does is it infers the possibility to be expressed. Obviously, everything that is expressed is expressible.
right.
But I think when Bonaventure is talking about the divine ideas, he's actually beginning from the actuality of the expressiveness of these ideas. So in Bonaventure's sense, he will presuppose, as really will Aristotle as well, that act precedes potency. But clearly from the act, the possibility or potency is presupposed, but Bonaventure begins with the divine being as eternally expressive of everything that's knowable, thus everything that's true. So that's where he's getting. It's an indication of God's activity and priority.
Okay.
And it's always, I think the notion of expressive also captures the fact that Bonaventure does not want to give the impression that God's knowledge it terminates in some sort of object that is then closed off in virtue of itself and as a kind of real relation between the divine intellect and the object of divine knowing. So he's saying the truth is always expressive, and this is just part of God's being as truth.
Right.
Did you have your hand raised?
Yeah.
I think.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna see if I got this right. Did you say with respect to the expressiveness that it was like a fecundity of the truth? Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And it flows from the divine being as infinite and thus ultimately fecund. So it's always expressive of the truth, but it never arrives at an expression of the truth that is somehow terminating God's primordial act of expressing the truth. So what Bonaventure is really doing is he's verbalizing or even adverbializing this language about God's being the source and the expression of truth in these different ideas, without ever saying that these ideas kind of end, or there's a kind of completeness or fullness to them that is somehow distinct from God's own fullness. Whereas any created being, it is an expression of the likeness that God has of creation, but there's a kind of term, there's an incompleteness of finitude that we can say that it's an expression or it's a representation. But it's not ultimately expressive or representative in terms of God's intrinsic mode of expressing the truth and then knowing the truth by means of these likenesses. And so in some sense, an analogy that Bonaventure uses is the divine essence as the sun. The sun expresses rays continually. It's always expressing these rays. However, these rays terminate and shine upon different objects that are then distinct from each other. Well, the light of the sun is still basically unified, and it's always expressive of these things, even if they terminate in distinct notions with distinct connotations. Alex?
So I think I see what my problem is, my question is, where I need to be, is the relationship between the expressiveness or the expression and the thing, like I guess the essence. So like the actual dog existing, Fido, right? And God's eternally expressing divine idea, which I understand. I think I understand it well enough by this distinction between practical knowledge or productive knowledge and knowledge by observation or something. So God's knowledge, God knows it, right? And that's why he produces it, rather than, oh, there's an essence there, and so God knows it by observation, so to speak.
Right. I think that's exactly what he's trying to avoid here.
So like in Anscombe's Intention, right, she has this passage where she says, it's not as if there are, like when you think of opening the window. So she considers the action of opening the window. She says you can understand that as a knowledge by observation, or you can understand that as practical knowledge. And she says it's not that there are two descriptions of the same thing, opening the window. There's one description, opening the window, right, which can be understood in two different ways. And so it seems like there's two different kinds of knowledge. It seems like there's two kinds of knowledge. But there's only one thing known.
Right.
So it seems like what God knows is Fido, right? Even before Fido. Just like I know of opening the window before I'm opening it, right?
Yes, but yes. I think you're getting right at it. What Bonaventure is trying to indicate is that by virtue of this expressive truth and all of these various exemplars, and you know what, I wrote out a diagram to address this very topic, at least as I imagine it, and now I can't find it. How silly. I don't know what I did with this.
I just typed in Anscombe.
Maybe I'll find it at some point.
The thing that I wanted you to comment on is just the relationship between this expressing idea and the essence of the thing.
Right. I think I was actually going to try to address that more as we got into question 4.
No problem.
Because I think that's kind of where we transgress or transverse the pivot between divinity and creation. But I think in order just to anticipate, I think the presumption is by virtue of God's infinity and his infinite knowledge, he sufficiently expresses every possible and actual truth. And in this sense, there's a priority of his knowledge of created things with respect to creation itself that sufficiently encapsulates and realizes the created essence itself. So in a sense, what Bonaventure is arguing, as will Scotus later, is a kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of indirect realism with respect to God's knowledge of created entities as such. Because he simply says that God knows the object by means of these eternal ideas. And now he avoids the collapsing of divine knowledge into a kind of divine idealism, because for the medievals, the language of by means of or in and through their representative or expressive likenesses, he's indicating, or the language of the ratio cognoscendi, the reasons or the reality by which God knows or foreknowing, he's trying to indicate that the ideas themselves, while terminating as expressive in God and thus fully intrinsic and eternal to God, absolutely independent, they still in some sense function as a divine likeness of the creature. So they function as a quasi-medium by which God then knows the thing in itself. Like the abstracted species.
I see what you mean.
They form the means by which you know something. You don't actually know the ideas, you know the object through the idea, even in natural knowledge according to Aristotelian philosophical psychology. So you begin with sense knowledge, right? The object, say the Fido again, is emitting sense data. It's hitting your senses, your eyes, your nose, your sense of touch, your sense of smell, probably not sense of taste. But so these are called the sensible species. They operate upon your senses, and then from those senses you gather what's known as the phantasm. And this happens through the internal senses that basically collate what we call a phantasm. And the phantasm is what's acted upon by the agent intellect, right? The phantasm then is supposed to abstract the universal idea of dogmas from this material stuff that we get from Fido out in the world. And then through that act of abstraction, the agent intellect, it creates a relation. The agent intellect, in fact, establishes a relation between the phantasm, which is already in relation through the sensible species to Fido. It creates a relation between the passive intellect and the phantasm and through the senses to Fido itself. And so what Aristotle and Bonaventure here are trying to indicate is that God's not locked into his own mind. Even though his knowledge is perfectly eternal and intrinsic, it's through these divine ideas that he knows created objects. And so this is why he makes a distinction between the kind of knowledge or idea that is caused by knowledge, or the kind of idea that causes knowledge. And Bonaventure says what we have through the process of abstraction is ideas that cause knowledge. right? We come to know something because we become acquainted with Fido. And through becoming acquainted with Fido, we become acquainted with dogness. So we arrive at knowledge. And Bonaventure just turns that on its head and says, no, in God, these ideas themselves cause the knowledge. They're not caused by knowledge, they're causes of knowledge. And so in this sense, he thinks if you affirm on the one hand the infinity of divine truth sufficiently expresses all possible and actual and future realities on the one hand, and these ideas themselves, these likenesses of God to a creature, are causes of knowledge, he thinks he can insulate himself from the accusation that God is somehow informed by some external reality because his knowledge in some way causes this reality. And with respect to contingent things, it's knowledge of his will act and his infinite power to create these realities from nothing and then through natural generation. And I kind of lost my train of thought there. But I mean, the point is that Bonaventure is trying to avoid a kind of divine idealism without admitting, here's the second part, is that he wants to also preserve, because it seems to be the case, that God has ideas. And these ideas in some way are not reducible to one another in terms of their meaningful content, what you would call quiddity. A dog is just simply not a cat. They're not the idea. They're not ideas of the same thing. They're irreducible. And God has distinct and perfect knowledge of dogness and catness, both in their essence and in all their possibilities and instantiations. And so he's trying to preserve the Augustinian notion of ideas without becoming an idealist on the one hand, and he's trying to also avoid attributing a kind of anthropomorphic Aristotelian notion of abstraction, a kind of the divine intellect being informed by a creature, on the other hand. But I think it's admissible that all of the moving parts are not explicitly worked out. But I think he's sufficiently carving up the distinctions in order to preserve these two fundamental truths. And so, yes, he does affirm that God knows things not through their proper essence, which means as the form informs matter to make a created and distinct thing, but rather God knows things through their representative or expressive likenesses. And remember, Bonaventure then distinguishes between two modes of similitude. One is with respect to how a divine idea, God represents a creature through a divine idea because the divine idea is distinct on the one hand. So God is in a sense filtered through this divine idea with respect to creation. And on the other hand, this particular created being like a dog expresses certain elements of the divinity through participation as a limited being, but as a being that's sourced in the divine created will that acts on the basis of these divine ideas. And so this goes to the question again of this kind of twofold relationship. So God represents creatures, and creatures represent God in different ways. And this gets to the question then, is that sufficiently clear, what the main parts of what Bonaventure's doing? Because he doesn't really provide much more explanation in this text of the actual ins and outs logically. He just kind of assumes that his explanation is sufficient, or perhaps there's not much more to be said because it's inherently mysterious. And he's committed to the phenomenological fact of ideas and a sufficient similarity between the way the mind works, the created mind works, and the infinite mind must work, because that's based upon his commitment to the created person as the image of God. And so in some ways a mirror of God, even if that image is reversed. And he's also wanting to avoid any kind of composition between God and creation, any kind of passivity between God and his knowledge of created things. Yes?
So is it advisable to think of a divine idea, the eternal ideas or exemplars or likenesses, as like perfect blueprint by which the person makes it, and that there's nothing, since it's a perfect blueprint.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing when he finishes making something by that perfect blueprint. There's nothing in a certain sense, there's no more content to the reality than that was already in the blueprint.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's very much in terms of information. There's already information that is front-loaded in a sense with respect to God's knowledge of things. And really the mystery of the created order is, the degree to which created things fail to measure up with a divine exemplar, or the degree to which a created thing can grow in grace and perfection and become more approximate to the perfect divine idea. And I think that's an area of thought in Bonaventure that needs further explanation and exploration. But I think you have exactly what's going on. It's a front-loading of information that's already in and present to the mind of God from all eternity as expressive. And so then let's move on then. Any further questions about that? This is complex material. But I think if we get the main, what's that?
That's helpful. Thanks.
Okay. Why don't we move back then to that page I sent you if there are no questions? That image.
It's not enough. Yeah. Perfect.
Do we have that in front of you?
Yeah.
You all?
Yep.
Yeah.
So you'll notice at the heading I have the Deus Esse et Trinus. And for Bonaventure, the divine esse or essence is always considered in conjunction with or right alongside with the Trinity of persons. But for sake of discussion, and this is something that he will engage in himself, we're going to focus on the esse, because this is a philosophical evaluation in terms of some of the absolute attributes. So move down to that notion of absolute attributes. Obviously, this list is incomplete. You'll find a list in of additional absolute attributes when you look at the De Mysterio Trinitatis and the Itinerarium, amongst other texts. So in the first place, then, you have the Deus Esse, or the divine being, which is just simply an affirmation of the divine essence which is identical in reality to each person, that is qualified by the absolute attributes of simplicity and infinity. Simplicity just simply means non-composition. God is not posterior to other bits or parts that come together to make him become God. God simply is what he is. He's not subject to increase or diminution. He's not subject to change. And then right alongside with simplicity, you have the notion of infinity. And infinity, obviously a perfectly simple being, is also going to be an infinite being. And infinity has to do with any kind of lack of limitation in the degree or perfection of God's being. So it has to do with the greatness of his being as well as the perfection of his being. So simplicity and infinity are two key concepts, and infinity will become ever more important in the Franciscan tradition as really the most basic and best concept we can have of God. Infinity speaks to the maximal mode of being and a being that has in himself, by virtue of his own perfection, every other possible perfection that's fittingly attributed to such a being. And then what you see next then is simple and infinite, according to the definition of Boethius, that Bonaventure explicitly cites in question 5 of the De Mysterio Trinitatis. Simple and infinite really come together conceptually to speak of God's eternity. Now, obviously, simplicity and infinity and eternity are not really distinct realities of God, but you can, through combining the notions of simplicity and infinity, come to a better notion of eternity, which actually informs us, as created minds, more about God than we knew just by having simplicity and infinity considered alone. So Boethius defines eternity, and again, remember, we're speaking of the divine being here, his essence, and absolute perfections of his essence. And this is important to see kind of how Bonaventure's conception of truth, light, exemplarity flow out of his understanding of the divine being, okay? This is why we're going through this, to see how it structurally or schematically fits together. So Bonaventure, just simply following Boethius' definition of eternity, speaks of eternity as the simultaneous and full perfection, or the simultaneous and perfect possession of life. But what you can see Bonaventure's done there is by saying simultaneous or simult altogether, he's speaking to simplicity. The simultaneity of the possession of life speaks to God's infinity, and the perfection of this life speaks to God's infinity. Did I get that backwards? I feel like I've said infinity twice.
You
Simplicity
did.
and infinity come together to form eternity. The simultaneous and full perfection of perfect life or absolute life. Simultaneous, simplicity, perfection, infinity. So you can see how Bonaventure just puts simplicity and infinity together to arrive at a notion of eternity. And eternity is another property of God that is unique to God. It's a transcendental property insofar as it transcends any kind of categorical predication. A categorical predication which implies finitude or incompleteness in some degree, a non-fullness. And just for the sake of clarification, what I mean by a categorical predication comes from Aristotle. Aristotle derived his kind of philosophical and linguistic taxonomy according to substance and accidents. And you have 10 categories that speak to substance and accidents. The highest category, the highest of the categories, is substance. And substance refers to a being that exists through itself. It has its own internal motive force of existence and unity. And then the rest of the 10 categories, the other 9, he calls accidents, right? So you have, substance, quantity, quality, place, relation, habit, time, position. I don't know if I've listed them all, but I've listed several. And the important point here to know about substance is because in Aristotle's account, a substance always has accidents because every substance is distinguished or realized in its concrete existence through accidents that adhere and qualify this substance as, being so big, being 6 feet long, being blue, being hot to the touch, being set above another level, like the leaf is above the trunk, that sort of thing. And so what my point is here is that when you speak of categories, you're speaking of limited beings, you're speaking of finite beings, because every substance that's organized or spoken of or predicated of in terms of categories is predicated or spoken of in terms of accident. And accidents are inherently limiting. And so then when I speak of a transcendental perfection, the basic aspect that we're getting at here is that a transcendental does not fall within the categories. Okay? And so when I say that eternity is a transcendental perfection, I'm just saying that it's not limited according to the categories. That's one way of thinking of a transcendental. Okay? Transcendental in its basic sense, though, however, means simply, and we can look at our list right here, off to the right-hand side, you can have a transcendental that's proper to God. That's what I'm speaking of in terms of simplicity, infinity, and eternity. This is a transcendental notion because it's not contained or it doesn't fall under any of the categories. It's not a finite substance. It's not an accident qualifying, a finite accident qualifying a finite substance. So some transcendentals can be spoken of as being proper to God. Other transcendentals refer to simple perfections, or what Bonaventure calls simple perfections, and what Scotus calls simply simple perfections, or perfectiones simpliciter simplex. And these happen to be perfections that admit of a realization in either a finite or an infinite mode, okay? But the rub here is that insofar as they're realizable in a finite mode, the quality or the perfection itself in terms of what it is cannot imply finitude. So it cannot imply that it's subject to quantity intrinsically. It's subject to color or quality or place or time intrinsically. And examples of these things have to do with spiritual realities. And so here's where the image of God becomes important. Because as a created image, obviously, we have certain faculties or powers that are intrinsic to our nature, right? We're material. Well, that's inherently limited, right? I mean, that's fairly obvious. I'm not there with you all in your various places. So there's limitation, there's materiality. But also then there are spiritual aspects such as intellection and volition. And here's where you can get into discussions of simple perfections or simply simple perfections in terms of transcendentals. Because now we have a concept that even though it's realized in a finite being, we can look at intellection and volition and say, there's nothing about intellection or volition as such, considered abstractly, that implies that it must be limited. It must be finite, it must be incomplete. In fact, we can know with pretty good certainty that the intellect as such is open to all that's knowable. And if there is a God, well then according to Bonaventure and Scotus, God knows an infinite number of things. And he has, through the power of intellect that we attribute to him. That's an essential quality to the created image. You also can have accidental qualities with respect to the created image that also are purely spiritual in this sense, that don't indicate any imperfection in themselves, but only in their realization in us. Think, for example, of wisdom or of mercy or justice. Those are habits or virtues that we have that are not essential to our nature, but they certainly perfect our nature, and in themselves don't admit of any limitation, because you can have divine wisdom, which is infinite, which Bonaventure's arguing. And so those are called simple perfections or transcendental disjunctive perfections. And that fancy language simply means is that as spiritual, as not indicating any kind of limitation with respect to the categories, they transcend the categories. They're not able to be bound within the categories. And the aspect of the disjunct simply locates the fact or points out the fact that on one end or one side of the disjunct, there's a finite realization, or the possibility in actuality of finite realization, and at the other side of the disjunct, there's an infinite realization. So then we can speak of a transcendental perfection according to a simple idea that can be manifest according to an infinite or a finite mode. And so that's another aspect of a transcendental in the Franciscan metaphysical and philosophical tradition. And then finally, the most basic notion of transcendentals that we speak of are coextensive transcendentals. And we call them coextensive with respect to the categories. Because anytime we speak of any real substance that is created, we have to speak of these substances in terms of these transcendentals. Because throughout all the categories and throughout every kind of created being, we implicitly supply as the very presupposition for speaking about these beings, these transcendentals that I'm about to list. And these coextensive transcendentals, meaning they run the entire length of the transcendentals, whereas transcendentals proper to God don't have anything to do with the categories, right? And disjunctive transcendentals don't have to do with every creature in every category. It has to do with spiritual realities. Well, coextensive transcendentals, they coextend to every category. And these transcendentals are simply being, unity, truth, and goodness. And St. Bonaventure would argue that in a certain sense, beauty is also a transcendental.
Yes.
But he takes the notion of beauty as kind of the convergence and flowering, a kind of flowering of unity, truth, and goodness in harmony and order. So beauty for him is the harmony of these three more basic transcendentals. But he will say that's a transcendental as well. So these notions of transcendentals are key metaphysical items by which to navigate God talk. And these are at stake and at play in Bonaventure's discussion here. And then after I take this question, we'll move down this chart. Go ahead.
Could you explain a little more what is meant by a finite or infinite intrinsic mode? I've heard of it like talked about with respect to being, but what is meant by an intrinsic mode of, I guess, existence or something?
Mm-hmm. Well, the intrinsic mode just designates how That's what a mode designates, is how a given quality is realized. So if you have an intrinsic mode that is finite, well, that quality will then be realized in a limited manner.
Okay.
It's not infinite. It doesn't. Your quality of prudence is not identical in terms of its extension and realization to my quality of prudence, assuming I have it. So in that sense, it's intrinsic in mode, but yet we would share the same quality of prudence, assuming I have it again. But with respect to an intrinsic mode that is infinite, well, this has to do with this mode in its perfection, in the perfection of the quality, is actually maximal. It cannot be any greater. And that's predicable exclusively of the divine being or divine essence. So our modes, when we speak of a finite mode, well, it's limited. It can even be accidental. We could lose this quality. Whereas with God as infinite, it's fully itself, and in some sense, it's the exemplar of all finite instances of such qualities. So intrinsic mode of infinity has to do with the proper mode of God's existence as maximally perfect, as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Whereas our modes of intrinsic finite qualities, intrinsically modal finite qualities, they admit of increase, they admit of diminution, they admit of complete loss, they admit of even absence. Somebody can completely lack prudence. You see what I'm saying? But it's in potency. He would be in an objective potency to becoming prudent. And so that's what it's getting at. It's designating the radical distinction between God and himself and in his perfection, in his infinite perfection, where every perfection is essential to his own perfection and in no way accidental, and our perfections that we have, the same qualities by name and by concept, but finite, limited, imperfect, participatory in those perfections. Participation here just meaning simply a limited instantiation of a perfection that God possesses by nature, and we possess by contingent existence, by the will of God. So does that help clear that up at all? I mean, we can go on about this because it's a key concept, because what Scotus and Bonaventure actually are doing is by using these transcendental terms, these disjunctive transcendentals especially, is they're actually saving a way to speak about analogy. Because on the one hand, they're affirming that any finite instantiation of a perfection that's properly spoken of God, well, that it has to be the same notion, or else we can't say anything of God. But because we're finite and God is infinite, the intensity or the maximal realization of these properties are in no way commonly measurable. One is simply infinite, one is finite, and you can never bridge an infinite gap by any finite being or action, or any series of finite being or action. It already presupposes God's infinite power to create and call things out of nothing into being. And in that sense, and because of that free creation, we can then speak of and actually discover perfections of God that are proper to God in an infinite way, and proper or accidental to us in a finite way. Yes, go ahead.
So, in regards to this would be distinct from the Thomistic way of talking about, because I get this sense with the Thomistic way, you have this various perfections, but they all end up being sort of united in this, completely united in this transcendental, like Neoplatonic one almost, where there's no actual distinction between them because they don't have a formal distinction. And so as a result, that you don't, there's sort of a horizon past which you can't really see how, these different things are absolutely identical. And you just sort of have, after that, all you have is the apophatic knowledge.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think I don't think the transcendentals for St. Thomas function as robustly epistemologically and then with respect to their metaphysical reference, if you get what I'm saying there by that, with respect to God, as they do for the Franciscan school. Now, the Franciscan school just simply takes for granted that we know things because these things are the way they are. We know them because that's the way they present themselves to us. And so we can know that the idea of a cat is not identical to the idea of a dog in an absolute or absolutely undifferentiated manner. And we also know that we don't invent a distinction between a cat and a dog. No, cats and dogs were invented, thereby we have a distinction in that sense. So they will say, you know, with respect to even divine ideas, there has to be some minimal distinction, or difference, what Bonaventure, the term Bonaventure uses, or a formal distinction, the term that Scotus uses. St. Thomas, on the other hand, with respect to the Transcendentals, so far as I understand him, and there are some footnotes in, I think there's a footnote in Caritas and Primo, I don't remember what page it's on. Actually, I just opened up to it. Strange, I must read it a lot. Page 256, note 167, it speaks to how St. Thomas understands the notion of divine ideas and how they're unified. For St. Thomas, it appears that God doesn't understand or have knowledge of distinct ideas through himself or in himself. He rather has knowledge of distinct entities through his actual act of creation. And so he knows a potential infinity of distinct items based upon the fact of what he created. But in terms of his eternal understanding, there's what you might call a kind of simplicity soup, where it's all in there virtually, because God did it, it must be there somehow. But there's no real means of explaining it, because St. Thomas denies any notion of a formal distinction. Thus, he must collapse even the ideas into a real identity, and then speak of their difference in terms of creation, in terms of the means by which he actually creates a dog as distinct from a cat, as distinct from a man, in virtue of a kind of virtual distinction. But for Scotus, a virtual distinction doesn't seem robust enough to motivate creation, on the one hand, because it seems insufficient knowledge to create. God is not creating in a most informed or knowledgeable manner because he doesn't seem to have the actual ideas of what he's creating. That's one possible critique. And then secondly, with respect, moving back into the divine knowledge, it seems as though these essences or quiddities are just distinct because they're distinct. God knows them as distinct in some way because they are distinct in some way by virtue of just being what they are. God doesn't create them or make them that way. He just simply knows them that way because he knows all things. And this is why Scotus especially developed a formal distinction, is to navigate this middle ground where there are distinct and irreducible concepts that don't yet imply a diminution of God's simple perfection.
I guess
Alec, go. Oh yes, brother.
the particular thing where I'm wondering with this maximal, like an infinite of intrinsically maximal perfections, is whether that would maybe be critiqued by some as a form of ontotheology, where you're saying that God is, you're just taking your idea of justice and wisdom and knowledge and truth and love and pumping it full of steroids and calling that God.
Right.
And I think that, I don't know if that'd be a Thomistic criticism, because at least it's come up in our modern philosophy class as a criticism of sort of the modern natural theology of this sort of.
Well, I think what's important here is that the ontotheology that's spoken of seems to presuppose that being is a genus with respect to species, rather than being a true transcendental that is not a genus of anything, because a genus always admits of species and difference. But with being itself, being in and of itself, it doesn't imply species and difference. Species and difference arrives out of categorical predication with respect to substance and accidents, or genus and its properties, essential properties. But being itself for Scotus and Bonaventure is not a genus under which then you can fit conceptions of God and creation according to a broader kind of prior reality. Being itself is just that to which actual existence is not repugnant. That's Scotus's definition. Being for St. Bonaventure is that which is in flight from nothing. In some ways, it's an apophatic statement or description of the possibility of any kind of being to be realized. And obviously, if you have a negation, it presupposes some insider intuition into something positive, but not something that you can conceptualize formally via a kind of particular idea, like an abstracted species of a dog. Being simply is the condition by which we reason about all other beings, this concept of being. But for Scotus and Bonaventure, being itself admits of no definition, because being itself isn't able to be determined in terms of genus and species and difference. You see, whereas with animal, you can have a brute or you can have a man, but the specific difference between the two is rationality. So a rational animal. Whereas with being, being is simply spoken of when you speak of everything. And then you limit being, or you affirm its maximal perfection, depending upon the type of being you're considering. So that's the first sense. And then the second sense is with respect to infinity talk. There's an affirmation that God must be absolutely infinite or maximal in his own being, just simply as a condition for the possibility of finitude. But it never claims that we have a proper concept of infinity through itself, because that would entail a contradiction. We cannot fit infinity into our heads. Our heads would explode. So we don't have a simple concept of an infinite being. We have more of a kind of mosaic of concepts that we know must be mutually compossible with each other, but we cannot capture infinity in a single concept in a comprehensive way. So there's kind of even an indirectness to our knowledge of infinity. An analogous example is trying to comprehend simultaneously the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the unity of God. We can argue both sides of the point independently or kind of in parallel tracks, and we can even show that they seem to be not in contradiction. So thus they seem to be mutually possible or compossible. But we cannot, I don't think you can, logically fit both of those concepts into kind of a simple flow of sorieties or syllogistic flow that can prove both at the same time, and thus imply a comprehension of both doctrines at the same time and through the same means. You have to have different starting points.
And I guess
so infinity is similar to that.
To sort of see if I understand that when we say maximal perfection, it's not saying like, I have a 100 gigabyte hard drive and I could have 50 gigabytes on it, or I could have a maximally full hard drive. Rather, we're saying that it's maximal in the sense that it's logically without lack.
Yes.
In the sense that that's something that's, well, to use the term, it's an intrinsically distinct mode. It's not just, within the same sort of area, but just we can't go any further. But it's something metaphysically, to the point where
what I think what it means is there was a difficulty coming out of Aristotelian philosophy, because Aristotle and many of the Greeks looked at infinity as bespeaking some sort of imperfection, a lack of an end. So it lacks a certain perfection. So it either lacks in itself the fullness of its own being in terms of the reason or final cause for the being itself, or it refers to material limitations. Those are some basic divisions of infinity. But Bonaventure says, well, you know, there's a positive sense to infinity too, because we want to say that there's no way of limiting God essentially. And no way of limiting God essentially would simply be by something not God limiting him and exhausting some aspect or fullness of his perfection. Does that make sense? So he wants to say there's a positive aspect to infinity, but he's stuck with the negative term. Okay? So God on the one hand is pure act and simple, but he's also infinite, insofar as no creature or nothing outside of God limits him. But in some sense, God is the limit of his own being, but because there's nothing outside of him that can limit it, we can say that he is infinite in that sense. And then Bonaventure makes a further distinction between material quantity and spiritual quantity. Mm-hmm. And so there's obviously an analogy there, because material quantity is countable, you know, and divisible into different bits, right? Spiritual quantity is saying it's a lot, but obviously it's not divisible. He's saying there's some infinite power, a power that's not limited, or a spiritual perfection that's not limited by anything other than God's own being and his own perfect actuality. And so this is why modern philosophers, God is infinite in spiritual power and he's perfectly actualized in himself. Thus, he's absolutely simple and infinitely perfect. But this is why modern analytic philosophers have moved away from the language of infinity, even though I still think it's good. They've moved from the language of infinity with respect to God's spiritual intrinsic mode, his perfection and his full actuality, to the language of maximal. Because what they're trying to move away from is the ambiguities of infinite. As well, with respect to what is the infinite, I don't get it. And so they use the term maximal to say that God is really fully himself, and he's that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But the problem is our language and our concepts can't measure up to what God is. We can know that he is this, but we can't even really know, properly speaking, through a simple concept, what that thing we know about God must be really is. And so they use the term maximal to indicate really logical insurpassability. Logically speaking, there's nothing greater than God. There's no way of going beyond this. It's an absolute. It's an expression of absoluteness that's unable to be exceeded. And so this is this language of maximal. It doesn't have to do with comparing two measures according to a common according to a common material state of affairs. Like 16 board feet versus 8 board feet. There's nothing like that going on. It's actually using metaphors or analogy of quantity to try to express, because everything we know is numbered. And Bonaventure in Book 2 of the Itinerarium says number is the primary or foremost exemplar in the mind of God, that there must be some way of speaking using number, because that's what we know, number and distinction. We must be able to use this language of God, but making the proper metaphysical and semantic and logical qualifications.
All right, I think I'm satisfied.
Well, I'm not.
Okay, I mean, in the sense that I just want to see how you could sort of defend where we're saying. I mean, in the sense that, in regards to my question about how
No, I'm just giving you a hard time, brother.
All right. I'm not saying satisfied. It's just like, okay, yeah, I get that now. Next.
I got God. Let's move on. Okay. No, that's not happening. Alex.
Another idea that I the idea of a standard, like a normative component. So when Aristotle, for example, defines virtue or excellence, right, he has to refer to the concept of a prudent person, right? When he defines virtue of character, right, he says it's a state that chooses, consisting in a mean relative to us, defined by reason, the reason of the prudent person. So the prudent person himself is the standard. And so in a way, God is the standard, or there's a normative component. So there's no way to measure knowledge except against the standard, and God's the standard.
Right.
So he's the very standard of knowledge. So everything
And
measures
it's-
up.
yeah.
Everything measures up to God because he is the standard, as opposed to we measure God by a standard and he's just a lot more than everybody else. As if
That's right. Yeah, that's the mistake of considering like being, for example, a genus with species. No, we don't measure being. We don't measure God against being. In fact, we speak about being in terms of its maximal perfection by what we can infer about God.
So the
And so
maximal,
God is.
maximal is like excellence.
That's right. Yeah, it bespeaks of fullness. It bespeaks an ultimate aspect, a superlative type of statement. But in no way, though, does it imply that we have a concept of God's maximal perfection through itself. We have basically a bunch of concepts, that we put together in complex statements about God. And so that should be sufficient to avoid the notion of, or the accusation of ontology, is that it's based upon a simple misunderstanding, a very basic and elementary misunderstanding of what's going on when Scotus and Bonaventure use this language. And for that matter, Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, St. Maximus the Confessor, John Damascene, and any other saint who are on this point. But, I wanted to get through the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ today.
We're almost to where we were last time.
I don't know about anybody else, but I don't think there's any regrets.
Well, thank you. That's encouraging. Let's move down then. So we have this notion of eternity. And then we move into, look at this one true good aspect, right under eternal. And those are what we call coextensive transcendentals. Now, coextensive indicates, yes, they're coextensive with all the categories, but also in their fullest sense, God is most unified, most true, most good. They also are properties, essential properties of God. Now, look at that middle button. Boy. The middle term, truth. There's true, right? And true has this notion that is both with respect to the intellect, the power of intellect to know, but also with the notion of the truth or realities or items, knowable items that are expressed. And this is what Bonaventure is speaking to. By virtue of God's absolute property of being true, he is the truth. And truth pertains to those things that are knowable and known. And so as a light, this is why he speaks of light, God's transcendental quality of truth can be conceived of in terms of the metaphor of light at its source, light expressing. And so this is this notion of expressive light, from the true to the truth, to the light expressing or expressive of all possible truth. So Bonaventure wants to indicate a couple of levels after this, is he expresses this infinite truth through one exemplar. Because God's act is perfect, he's sufficient in this infinite act to express all truth, simply, through one exemplar, right? And so this is emphasizing again the unity. Bonaventure doesn't yet have the categories explicit that Scotus will have to, on the one hand, preserve simplicity, while on the other hand, affirm very robustly the formal distinction between these ideas. So he oscillates between the one exemplar, which is just simply unified, God's infinite expressive knowledge that's entirely intrinsic to him, and then underneath that, the unum exemplar to divine knowledge of exemplars, his extensive knowledge. And this is where it comes into the notion of exemplar, the ratio, or ratio cognoscendi, the means of knowing the ideas and the eternal art. And so you can see through this chart how these ideas are kind of layered, moving from God's absolute simplicity and infinity down to, while maintaining his simplicity and infinity, down to how Bonaventure can articulate the expressiveness of the one exemplar, and within that one exemplar, a kind of difference or minimal difference between all the other contingent essences and realities that are expressed by that same simple expression of truth through the one exemplar. So Bonaventure has a notion of the exemplar and of truth and of the idea with a capital T, But he also, under that, he speaks of exemplars, ideas, truths, with the lowercase t. And what he's actually really trying to do here is just preserve the perfection of God's knowledge, and also at the same time preserve a realistic, yet sophisticated account of human knowledge of what we can say about what God knows. And so in that sense, this chart helps to kind of navigate the moments in Bonaventure's discussion. Because on the one hand, he's trying to affirm God is absolutely simple, yet God is infinitely perfect. God's idea is infinite, and unified. Yet within this infinity, he actually has eternally expressive every possible truth, every present truth, every future truth, and every final truth or eschatological truth. So Bonaventure's trying to keep all of these pieces together. And that's what's going on in questions 1, 2, and really even question 3. I'd like to move on now, if there are no questions that are pressing.
Quick question.
Yes.
On your chart, at the bottom, intrinsic, and you got in parentheses, is that like the creature?
Yes, that's right.
And connotation?
Okay, yes, I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. The notion of intrinsic, like to creature, has to do with the fact that God is like a creature insofar as he's really identical to his expressive or representative ideas. He's like to creature insofar as he expresses these ideas of creaturely essences and creaturely realities. That's how God is like to creature. And then I say with connotation, that's with respect to the creature. So in a sense, this gets to the question that Alex raised earlier, is that even though he expresses himself in a likeness to a creature through these expressive and representative likenesses, it's also through these expressive and representative likenesses that he knows creatures. So there's a connotation or respect of reason, a relation of reason between God's idea of a creature and the creature itself. And so there's one that is intrinsic entirely, and then one that also speaks to or connotes the extrinsic created order.
Thank you.
And I think basically this is a fuzzy area in my own understanding of Bonaventure, and I think it's because he's not always explicit on this point, is with this notion of connotation. Bonaventure will affirm that God is infinite from eternity. Thus, his knowledge is infinite from eternity. He knows all knowable things from eternity. And in this sense, at least God is ontologically prior to any creation, or his will actually to create this thing. So God has infinite knowledge in a way that's absolutely independent of creation, right? But connotation, he will speak of these ideas connote distinct or really distinct things by virtue of their relation to created things. But that's difficult to square with his notion that he is eternally, the truth itself is eternally expressive of an infinite number of ideas, on the one hand, as distinct. God knows all things distinctly in their perfection from eternity, and yet say there's a connotation with respect to creation if he's expressing and if the connotations are eternal. And so what I'm suspecting Bonaventure is really getting at is he's thinking in terms of the ideas themselves as finite ideas, like ideas of finite beings, and as finite, radically or inherently or essentially contingent beings. And so there can be a relation of reason with respect to just the contingency of the being itself that then becomes actualized, again, as contingent in the actual reality of creation. So this notion of connotation has to do with something is connoted eternally. And it's connoted eternally not just with respect to present creation, present realities of creation, but with respect to every contingent or finite essence. There's a connotation of finitude and contingency that can be realized, or it doesn't have to be realized. And so I think this reading brings Bonaventure a little bit closer to what Scotus will say. with respect to divine knowledge. Okay, moving on. Now, here's an important discussion. This is where we really get into interesting things. Analogy and univocity. Now, Bonaventure distinguishes two kinds of resemblance, right? There's the resemblance of, what does he say? Proportion, two things to a third, and simple resemblance, right? Are we remembering this rightly? Okay. I think what's going on here is Bonaventure refuses, or he will not admit that there's univocity between a creature and the creator in any sense. And the reason why is because of what you might call old style univocity, Aristotelian univocity. And for Aristotle, or old style univocity, here, I have another picture. Is this too inconvenient?
So let's do it.
You got the whole thing?
Just a moment.
Can you see it, I mean?
Hold it still. That's pretty good. Wait. Oh, down a bit. Bring it down a bit. There you go.
Everybody see it?
Yep.
Okay.
You get it?
Right here, this discussion, this issue is at the heart of what Bonaventure's getting at with his distinction in terms of likeness between proportional or univocity and simple resemblance. So old style univocity, and then univocity here needs to be distinguished from equivocal or analogical, and you can see that on the upper right hand corner. Equivocal for Bonaventure just simply means there's a unity in name only but nothing else. They share like a bat, a baseball bat, and a flying mouse bat. Analogy exists when there's no commonality of nature, but of some sort of proportion or proportionality, and we'll get to that, what that means, the distinction. It's not always used consistently in St. Bonaventure, but there is a distinction between proportion and proportionality. Okay, and then univocity for Bonaventure, and here's where the real kicker is, and he gives this definition of univocity, probably his clearest statement of univocity, and then why he has to reject univocity. In the first book of the Sentences, Distinction 1, Article 3, Question 1, Dubium, or a doubtful question, number 5. And that's the first volume of the Koraki edition, page 43. And univocity for Bonaventure means there is something common according to both name, and here you can gloss concept, because for Bonaventure, a name is a sign of a concept. And so there's something common according to name and the real thing itself. Bonaventure says rem. And what that means is, yeah, the real thing that we're talking about. There's something common to that as well. So something common in name and in the real thing itself. And of course, Bonaventure rejects that, because even though you say there's something common, even in simple resemblance, right? Any idea you might have that there is also a divine exemplary counterpart, right? There's a common name. We could say cat, the divine exemplar of cat, and my idea of cat, and what's a good name for cat? Buttons, over there sitting on the shelf. What Bonaventure's saying is there can't be univocity amongst those three things, especially between divinity and the created idea. Now, here's an interesting aspect of his thought, though, is that for Bonaventure, and I think it comes through with Scotus as well, and this gets back to the infinity or maximal discussion, is Bonaventure understands that there can be resemblance and even a commonality in quality, but not in quantity. And this gets this notion of finite, infinite. So there cannot be a commonality between God and creation according to quantity. And thus, there cannot be a commonality that there cannot be a univocal predication of a creature and of a divine reality, namely wisdom. There can only be analogical, because obviously the created concept in my head is unequal to God's concept and God's own intrinsic or essential reality as wise. Does that make sense? And so for Bonaventure, in order to have univocity, in some ways there has to be an equality in quantity. So with respect to abstracted species, obviously, my idea of buttons over on the shelf isn't 3.5 feet long, right? And so there's some difference in quantity there. But in terms of the extent of the concept itself, it does perfectly measure to the essence or formal quiddity of buttons as a cat sitting over there. But my idea of cat, even though it's the same quality, you might say, as the divine idea, well, the problem here is that the divine idea is really identical to the essence of God. And my idea is just a finite accident. I could even forget about a cat. And so in that sense, there's an inequality there that disallows for Bonaventure univocal predication. And those are important things to note, is that what's at stake for Bonaventure is something more than what's at stake for Scotus with respect to univocity. Because Bonaventure is including not just the concept or the name, but he's also including in the consideration of analogy and equivocity and univocity. He's considering both the concept or name and the reality under consideration. Whereas with Scotus, he will just say, let's just leave off the reality itself we're speaking of, and let's just speak of the concept or the quality that we're speaking of. And so we can affirm a simple resemblance qualitatively between a divine idea and a created idea, but we certainly aren't going to affirm an equality in quantity between a finite essence and a divine essence. Does that make sense, what's going on and what's at stake? So Bonaventure is actually operating with an older, more purely Aristotelian concept of analogy and univocity here. Whereas Scotus, he makes it more logical and is able to affirm what Bonaventure affirms and also say it too. I don't know why I find that funny.
So when you say logical, just to be clear, what that means when you say he's saying something in a more logical way, you're talking about in a way more suited to the workings of the mind, and not saying that Bonaventure was illogical and then.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I'm
just
not
wanted to
saying
sort
that,
of.
no. Yeah, I'm saying Bonaventure set the bar too high, though, on this question. I do think he set the bar too high, but that was his context. And I think objectively, he's already making and using these same distinctions, but he's using them under a different name, namely simple resemblance rather than conceptual univocity. Does that make sense? But no, what I mean also, especially, that's an issue for Scotus in terms of logic, is what he says is that there must be univocity in a concept such that it can function as a middle term in a syllogism or demonstration without entailing a contradiction or an ambiguity. And so he begins with the basic concept of being. If you say this, God is either a finite being or an infinite being. God is an infinite being. Well, there has to be univocity between finite and infinite with respect to the term being, and then thus univocity with respect to the conclusion or the statement that God is infinite being. You see, that's what Bonaventure is getting at. I mean, Scotus is getting at. He's affirming that there must be conceptual univocity to even begin to reason logically about God and say anything meaningful about God at all. Whereas Bonaventure is understanding by univocity that it has to have not merely a common nature or a common name or concept, but it also has to share in some way in the same nature. Okay? Now, look down in terms of univocal on the left side of that page. This is the first example and that Bonaventure gives in terms of resemblance. Okay? So this is the species of univocity that Bonaventure is operating with or presupposing. It's when two things somehow participate or are said of a third thing in which they share in terms of nature or kind. And so, for example, you can say the genus animal is shared by a dog and a man. You can say animal of man and dog univocally, because they share the same concept of animal, and they share, at least in part, the same nature as animal. Does that make sense? So there's univocal predication there. Two things in a third, man and dog in animal. Going down, you can have two species in a genus, or two instances of a kind. When you say Peter and Paul are both man, obviously they share in the same name as man and the same nature as man. Now, naturally, when you try to do that with God, what you end up is what the ontotheologian or the critics of ontotheology accuse Bonaventure and Scotus of doing. Look on the right-hand side of the page. You have the notion of being that you predicate as though being were some genus that admits of some sort of nature in and through itself, that God and creature both participate in. Right? No, Bonaventure rejects that. And because he presupposes that that's what you must have for analogy, two things in a third, or two things with respect to a third, because he presupposes that, he rejects univocity. Okay? Then moving down, is that sufficiently clear what's going on here? So Bonaventure is operating with an older version of univocity, and he's saying that we must reject univocity because we can't really speak about God and creation because they share in no way the same nature. Is that sufficiently clear? Any questions?
The text over to the right of the page,
Yeah.
what does that say?
Basically, it's improper to use this language because we can't use univocity. Basically, all I was saying is you have to negate univocity. I don't even remember what I was thinking when I wrote that, so I can't really explain it to you.
Well, I mean, I'm wondering, I'm just looking at the text and with the picture, I can't even really make out what.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. The text on the left-hand side is being with respect to God and creature, and substance with respect to God and creature. Is that legible?
Yeah, but the further over.
Yeah, that's just obiter dicta.
That's what?
All I'm saying. See that?
Must use. Must use.
You must use analogy. You can't use univocity when speaking about God. That's the whole point there. I think that was the point of that. And now I have another paper. Can we take a picture of this really fast?
Just so I haven't got that one paper yet. I don't know if I got forgotten or not, or if it's just their processing. I would like a copy of it at some point if I could, if it's not too inconvenient.
I don't think it will be. If they don't get one to you by the end of class, if we forget somehow, I can take a picture and send it to you too. Maybe next week I'll actually do that beforehand. I think I have all my as the great Scarlet Pimpernel said, I have carriage wit, and I think I have carriage foresight. I always think of what I'm going to say or what I should have done after the fact on the way home in the car or the carriage. So forgive me. I should have done that earlier. But here's this other picture. Can we see it?
Up.
Down a bit.
Down a little. That's it. Got it.
Okay. So moving from Bonaventure's discussion of and rejection of univocity based upon grounds that are legitimate in themselves but different than what Scotus will affirm the use of univocal concepts, we move then to analogy. And Bonaventure actually has two main species or kinds of analogy. And And one is analogy of proportion or proportionality, and the other one is the analogy of simple resemblance. And what I want to suggest is that simple resemblance, in terms of A, a common quality, but B, a radically or infinitely distinct quantity, is precisely the point of Scotus's univocal concepts. And then I want to further argue that even, because Bonaventure will say there is even a proportion in simple resemblance. There's only a proportional analogy. And I want to say, okay, I grant that. But I think the proportion still designates both a ratio or a relationship between things, but a relationship that is unique and designates this kind of thing. So you can have one concept even if they're in slightly different ratios or relations, because you can have an insight into the ratio itself as designating this kind of thing. Okay, now maybe that's probably opaque, and it probably is opaque to me, but maybe as I try to explain it, it'll make more sense to all of us. So in the first sense then, analogy, look on the top of your page if you have that. You have the analogy of proportion and the analogy of proportionality. And this does not actually speak to any common quality or name, usually. And just to be fair, Bonaventure at times uses both terms improportionally, inconsistently. So for example, analogy of proportion, it doesn't necessarily have to do with univocal predication, affirming a common nature, because again, it's a kind of 2-to-1 comparison. But it has to do with, well, maybe it does have to do with a 2-to-1. Maybe it does have to do with some sort of, no, it doesn't, it can't. Proportion has to do with a comparison of two things to one in terms of a common ratio. So you could say,
healthy food and healthy urine and health.
2/4 and 2/4 and 1/2 in comparison to, or 5/10 in comparison to 1/2. You see, there's a 2-to-1 comparison, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with the same nature, because 2/4 doesn't necessarily indicate, maybe that's a bad example, because it is a common ratio, but what it does, it designates a relation of two things to one thing that are analogous. There's an analogy between 5/10 and 2/4 that both have to do with 0.5 or half. You see that? Does that make sense? Brother Charles, you had something?
I mean, I didn't know if just a common example of, healthy food, healthy climate to health. And just
Yeah, that's a good example. That's a lot more obvious. Yeah, that's right. Healthy food, healthy body, healthy urine, that sort of thing. That's a 2-to-1 proportion that all of the medievals use. Then you have proportionality, which is a relationship of two things to two things. And again, we're talking about a kind of ratio or proportion or arrangement that is similar, but it doesn't designate or note the same thing. So for example, a common example of 2-to-2 proportionality is the teacher of a classroom as to the captain of a ship. Obviously, there's a similar kind of relationship insofar as both the teacher directs the classroom and the captain guides and directs the ship. But obviously, a teacher and a captain are different in nature, and a ship and a classroom are different in nature. So that's a kind of 2-to-2 proportionality. And so there's distance, and you're not actually talking necessarily about any kind of commonality in quality. You're talking about a relationship that's common. Insofar as the terms or the relata of the relationship relate in a similar way, a recognizably similar way to each other as two other relata relate. And so this is analogy in a loose sense, and I think in some sense St. Thomas never gets beyond analogy of proportionality or analogy of proportion. And going back to the the notion of health is the difficulty here is that with respect even to the example of health as healthy body or healthy food or healthy urine, they actually, one is a primary analogous, obviously healthy body, and healthy urine is really quite a metaphorical and loose usage of the word health. Because you can't really say that intrinsically urine is healthy, rather it's an indication of health. And so there's quite a distance between a healthy body and healthy urine. But in a similar way, when you speak of being or perfection, created beings are closer to the healthy urine than the healthy body with respect to God. And if you're really sick, it can become very loose. The usage and the relationship between God and creature. Because obviously the primary analogous with respect to the example of food and urine with respect to the body is the body. The body is the health. And so a healthy body is the condition of healthy urine, and healthy food is the cause of the healthy body. But neither food nor urine indicates or intrinsically denotes health. And so it's very difficult to see how food or urine can be healthy or healthful. It's only by virtue of the relationship of both of these things as causes or effects of health that we say they're healthy. So it's more of a metaphorical usage. But in some sense, though, when St. Thomas speaks about being or perfect being, he says the primary analogous in reality itself is God, but the primary mode of signification is the creature. But it's hard to bridge the gap between God and creature, because the creature is never sufficient to signify a divine quality through itself. It's kind of like if you just had urine or food, and you didn't have bodies that eat food, you just had angels, and angels didn't know about the possibility or actuality of human beings, they would have no idea or no concept, probably, of what healthy urine would look like, or healthy food. I mean, if God created through his absolute power healthy urine and healthy food, they would never have an indication that it's healthy. There would always need to be a basis for this analogous in a healthy body to indicate how healthy is functioning, analogous. Well, the difficulty here is that when we speak of healthiness, or we signify health, or being rather, with respect to creatures, we're always signifying being in terms of a finite and limited mode. And there's no usage of univocal concepts and transcendental disjuncts with St. Thomas. And so it's very difficult to move from the primary significant, or the first concept we have of being, to an infinite being that we say, or a perfect being that we say is the primary analogous, because we simply have no concept of God. And so it's very difficult to move into a discussion or a meaningful, logically consistent discussion of the divine being that is in any way positive, conceptual. And this is why St. Thomas, in a sense, falls back on apophatic language and concepts, which I think St. Bonaventure and Duns Scotus can both affirm and use, but they can affirm and use it precisely by virtue of the fact that they do have something positive to say, and they realize that this positive thing that's said is infinitely exceeded by the reality. And so that's a difference or a difficulty in St. Thomas. Moving then from proportion and proportionality to simple resemblance, and here's where St. Bonaventure's presentation is really quite exciting, because he's doing something quite new. This is a distinction from everything I can tell that's pretty new with him. It may be radically new in its formulation with St. Bonaventure. And this, he simply says, is a one-to-one correspondence. So he's just saying something is like another thing. The exemplatum is like the exemplar. There's just simply a one-to-one relationship. And Bonaventure, going on, though, does not want to say this is univocal. Why is it not univocal? Because for Bonaventure, again, my concept, the exemplatum, what I know through a created idea, is not coextensive with, in terms of quantity, the divine idea, because the divine idea is radically identical with the divine essence, even though in the resemblance itself, there's something qualitatively common to my idea of a cat and God's idea of a cat. Okay, so that's the first thing. Bonaventure wants to say this analogy of simple resemblance is truly analogy, and there's no univocity of it, but that's because he includes in his conception of univocity, there must be a common reality or nature between the two. And of course, God is not man, not a creature, and a creature is not God in his ideas. But I think what we're getting at, though, in affirming simple resemblance and affirming a common quality, you're getting at what Scotus will then speak of in terms of univocal concepts with analogous disjunctive modes of realization or reality. Is everyone following me here? Basically?
I missed some of this stuff earlier because my computer flipped out when I tried to download the thing, so I missed some stuff, but just keep going.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it, well, this might be being recorded.
It is.
Okay. Maybe the whatever minutes you can listen to. And so what this indicates going down the list is that the created idea and the uncreated idea have a kind of cause to cause relationship, such that the divine idea of dog simply represents or is representative of or expressive of the created dog and the created idea of dog. And the created idea of dog is simply a resemblance of the divine idea. But the interesting thing is Bonaventure still is speaking here in terms of a vertical relationship in which there are two distinct concepts. But by what means, the question that needs to be raised, by what means can these concepts be understood as one being representative of the other, apart from some sort of univocal moment or common quality? I don't think you can begin to explain it. Bonaventure doesn't explain it exactly what he means by it, but he posits an interesting distinction that I think will become very important later on, and important in his own thought with respect to divine illumination. So, Alex, you raised the question earlier of kind of what the nexus is in some ways between the eternal expressive creative idea and the created reality. And I think what we're seeing here in St. Bonaventure is that there's univocity and analogy in the simple resemblance. That needs to be further fleshed out. Exactly the moment of analogy and the moment of univocity, while preserving Bonaventure's explicit language and commitments. I think as systematic philosophers and theologians, we can go beyond Bonaventure in light of what Scotus and even later thinkers have said, but it's important to first understand why Bonaventure has certain commitments linguistically. Ultimately then, univocity entails a common nature. You can see that on the list. Univocity entails a common concept or name. Analogy entails a common concept, name, or even a quality, but a different kind of quantity. Okay? And so the analogy can be one of order. There's an intrinsic relation between the two, or an intrinsic ordering of something to another, or it can be one of proportion, as we've already discussed. And I think ultimately, though, what Bonaventure is getting at with questions 1 through 3, moving into question 4 of the De Scientia Christi, is that things in themselves, by virtue of likenesses or ideas or exemplars and exemplatum, things are realities in themselves in terms of substantial quiddity or essence, but also things function as essentially signs. You see, in a sense, even when Bonaventure speaks of, after talking of simple intelligence, we covered this last week, he speaks of the mirror, remember speculum? And then he speaks of exemplars. Well, a mirror is not the thing itself in a certain sense. It's reflected through a sign. And the exemplar insofar as God is like a creature, or God is a divine idea is representative of a creature, that has a certain kind of sign function by which God knows and wills. And on the flip side, creatures know by means of signs. When you know in essence, you know not only the thing, you know in some way the source of the thing. And this will become more apparent next week when we actually get to question 4, God willing. But then look on page 4. Alex, you don't have this, do you? Page 4, the fourth picture.
I have the pictures now. Yeah.
Okay. At the top, when you see speculum, exemplar, idea. You see that little on the bottom right of the page here?
Yes.
And then there's that bracket around that says semiotics, vestige, image, similitude.
Yeah.
Okay, what I think is going on here is at the top of it, I have this bubble kind of elliptical shape. Speculum is second in order of intention, or in order of division of knowledge after simple intelligence with respect to the divine being. You have simple intelligence, and then the aspect of the mirror. Then you have the aspect of the exemplary idea. And how does that what am I trying to say? How does that cross the uncreate create divide? I think it's only through divine volition. It's the created action of divine volition, and I think this has important indications, because up to this point we're speaking of things natural to God. God doesn't will them to be. I mean, he accepts them and approves them by his will, but he doesn't will them to be efficiently. He doesn't cause them. He's not spontaneous with respect to his knowledge. But he is certainly spontaneous with respect to creation. This has two implications. It prioritizes, in some sense, how he's able to both bridge the gap between himself, between infinity and finitude, and also how he knows the finite reality. Both of these things are bridged through the power of the will to create, and the knowledge of what he wills, in that sense. And so this indicates that there's a certain order and priority in terms of dignity and in terms of final causality given to the voluntary power over the natural power, the voluntary power of volition and the natural power of intellection. And if there is a certain kind of ordered relation between intellect and will is in a sense more manifestative a word? Manifestive of personhood. And so this notion of personhood and the persons in God acting in and through the will seems to be really the locus of union between create and uncreate. And on the bottom half of that little funny elliptical thing, you have the speculum or exemplar, and we'll get to this next week. You know God, you know things as a mirror of the divine creative activity. In a mirror, they signify the source, but they also are reflecting in some way the created essence itself. In the mirror also you have the exemplar. But insofar as something is a mirror, it's reflecting God. It's a sign of God in this sense. And insofar as it's an exemplar, the exemplar itself, in terms of the mind attaining to the eternal art through divine illumination, the mind reaches certainty or judgment. And this is simply because all the created mind and the created objects known are unstable, and they're limited. Both move from non-being to being. So they don't justify ultimately or explain ultimately Aristotelian knowledge, which is knowledge that is immutable. Does that make sense? Knowledge of immutability. You need something else that's both complete and immutable. Well, that's why Bonaventure posits divine illumination, that in and through abstraction and with abstraction, you attain to the eternal reasons as regulating and motivating, in order to justify not your knowledge of the species, not your abstracted knowledge of the species, but for the certainty that the mind arrives at in saying, yes, this species is true. And the reason why, going back to our earlier discussion, is that Bonaventure posits that God's extensive knowledge is simply, or it reaches to every instance of a given kind. So this is what ultimately justifies our knowledge by abstraction from this cat about universal dogness, is that in and through our abstraction from this, dog to universal dogness, we also attain to the divine ideas as regulating and motivating, and this justifies our certain judgment about these items of knowledge beyond just simple apprehension, because God's knowledge actually is coextensive with every possible and every actual instance of a cat or a dog. It's an extensive knowledge that exhausts the range of the universal, and so that's why it can be immutable, because there's no surprises with respect to God's knowledge of a cat, whereas there could be surprises with respect to our knowledge of a cat. We might think a fox is a cat, that sort of thing. Alex, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Are the divine ideas? So are the divine ideas? Are there two different types? Or there's more than two different types. So is there a distinction between divine ideas that are of individuals? So like of buttons, or my cat's name is Bean, so of buttons and of Bean, or Fido and Fifi.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there's the divine idea that they share in common, which we call the common nature.
Yeah.
So, and then when we abstract, right, we're not abstracting the divine idea that's of Fido or of Fifi. We're abstracting the idea of the common nature.
That's right. That's right. You're right. That is true. Bonaventure affirms that God has perfect knowledge of everything common and singular, in each's proper reality. He says it in both the De Trinitatis and in the De Scientia Christi. I think, though, in terms of sets or orders of relation, the divine idea of catness, from our perspective, or the idea of catness in terms of its universal extension, would virtually include every possible cat. And thus, the exhausting of the universal is perfectly known, or catness is perfectly known when every cat is known, possible or actual. So in some sense, there's an ordered hierarchy between catness and Fifi and Fido and Bean and Boo Boo and all these other instances of a cat. But all of these particular instances of a cat are organized by virtue of the common notion of a cat. And so God has perfect knowledge of the common essence, and by virtue of which he has perfect knowledge of the common essence, because he knows every particular cat. So he has knowledge of both. And that's why, at least in part, Bonaventure says that certain judgment is justified by recurring to the divine idea, because by having the abstracted idea of catness, we recur to the divine idea of catness, but in God's idea of catness as a common notion is included every particular cat too, and every possible cat as well. And so God has perfect and exhaustive knowledge of everything there is to know about a cat or catness. And this is important. It may be a trivial thing in some sense in a modern context. I'm not sure it is. I'd have to think about it more. But for Aristotle, he said the fullness of the species of any given thing or kind is actually every instance of that species. So that's the full extent of the universal, is the every instance of that given kind. And so what Aristotle can't explain is actually how abstraction and certainty from abstraction is justified. Because for Aristotle, dogs were being generated and corrupted from eternity. And so it's simply impossible that we should ever arrive at an exhaustive knowledge of the universal and full range of whatever animal I was just talking about, dog or cat. And And so Bonaventure's responding, he's giving a direct response to that kind of thinking as well. It's like, well, wait a second. If we attain to the divine ideas, and we must attain to the divine ideas because we're de facto certain, well, then God's divine ideas must ratify or justify our certain judgments because God actually knows all these things. And so if we know one divine idea, well, everything implied or included in that divine idea or directly related to it is also certified in this sense.
Does he have a certain mark of certainty and then an explanation of error? Like, does he, I mean, can he explain how we think we might be certain, but we're actually wrong?
Yeah, I think he can. I don't know. I remember that question. No, I'll try to respond to that question. I think what he would actually how he would respond is that the intellect's proper object is truth, and when it's operating properly, it arrives at true knowledge. And he would account for error with respect to rash or hasty judgments that are not made with requisite consideration, or with respect to the senses, with respect to the judgment, the practical judgments that the senses are within their normal realm of power, but actually they're not. So, for example, a child is born with a deformity in his eye, and that's the way he always sees things. So he presupposes, he makes the judgment that his eye is functioning properly, and then he sees two things instead of one thing. But the normative aspect of the senses are based upon the normal operation, which is in some ways only recognized or realized inductively through multiple and common experiences of a given power. So in that sense, Bonaventure would attribute error with conviction of certainty to items of knowledge that don't properly admit of certainty, or to judgments made that are not adequately founded. But I don't think ultimately there's a perfect explanation for error in the face of the conviction that you're right. Actually, Dr. Plato is much more well-versed in that topic than I am. And so he might have something to add before he heads out.
I guess particularly because I'm trying to contrast in the paper right now Bonaventure and Descartes. And basically Descartes says the source of error is rash judgment or problematic with sense error.
Well, we can get to that. Alex might have something to say about this, but I think we can get to more of this discussion next week. We're about out of time here. But that's an interesting question. I think Bonaventure's position is quite distinct from Descartes, just simply by dint of his anthropology. It's radically different. Were you going to say something, Alex?
No, I'll wait. I'll look at some of that stuff in Descartes and see what I think.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that, because I think this has, this could be a very illuminating discussion, assuming we get to it next week.
Huge.
So next week we really will get through question 4, 5, 6, and 7, and I think we're almost there now, because we've discussed analogy, univocity, simple resemblance. We've got the basic working parts to begin to discuss Bonaventure's mechanism and metaphysics of illumination. And then also peeking ahead, you know what? Just look at question 4 and study that carefully, so you have it in your head, because I'm not going to go over the question itself. There's going to be a discussion next week about these problems. And I think we can just focus on question 4, and then at the end of the discussion, I'll summarize how questions 5, 6, and 7 work. And then we will move on the following week to the mystery of the Trinity. Because next week, it really is an essential component of Bonaventure's philosophy, his epistemology, his metaphysics, and it paves the way for what will become transcendental ontology, transcendental psychology of Scotus. These are the foundational aspects of it. So, is there anyone who wants to lead us in prayer to close?
Sure.
If there are no questions.
I guess the one request I would make is if you could maybe try taking a picture of those graphs yourself, because I think, well, on the last one, there's some bit that my picture wasn't distinct enough to read.
That's what I was.
Okay, I will do it.
And that'd be an
Okay.
interesting book for the future sometime, graphical commentaries on Bonaventure.
Oh, they're necessary. Absolutely. You can write it.
I'll let you know when I'm done.
All right, we should close. Thank you for your kind attention and your good questions. It was enjoyable.
Thank you,
So,
Dr. Goff.
anybody want to lead us in prayer?
Through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, may Almighty God bless all of you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we thank God for all the blessings and the life that He's given us, and help us to ask Him the grace of the Immaculate to help us to understand more deeply His mysteries.
Amen.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Ave Maria, good night.
Dr. Goff.
Bye, Dr. Plato. Goodbye, everyone.
We just
Good night.
keep going like this.